You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 191 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. We are up in the Lake District today, in Cumbria, to meet. Although, actually, are you in the lakes? You must be just outside the lakes.
We're just on the edge of it. We're just south of it, about by a mile, I think.
Yeah. So we're in Cumbria anyway to meet farmer and cheesemaker Martin Gott. I'm always excited when I love my cheese. I'm always excited when we have a cheese person on. Martin runs Holker Farm and St James Cheese with his wife Nicola. Martin and Nicola have rented the Cumbrian farm since 2006 after moving up from Somerset. They established a flock of milking sheep and began making farmhouse artisan cheese. Previously, Martin worked alongside two other cheesemakers, both making cheese from raw milk, one with goats in Somerset and one making Lancashire cheese near Preston. Martin grew up in Lancashire, and whilst he wasn't raised on the farm, his father did farm pigs near Kendal in Cumbria. After working for 4 years as a butcher for his father, he left to follow his passion in cheese and begin what would become his cheesemaking career. After 18 months in Lancashire, Martin moved with Nicola to Somerset to work part-time for legendary farmhouse cheesemaker Mary Holbrook. It was during this period that they bought some sheep and started experimenting with their own cheese, which resulted in St James Cheese. They returned north to take up their tenancy on just 20 acres of land. Alongside their 100 or so sheep during COVID, they took on a load of goats, now make goat's cheeses alongside the sheep's cheese. In 2018, Martin started a Nuffield scholarship on the subject of, quote, prevalence and importance of indigenous bacterial cultures in raw milk cheese, which took me, I find that a riveting title. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But that took him to the US. And among other things, he learnt about microbiology from a cheese-making nun who held a PhD. I'm also intrigued by that story. Martin, welcome to Meet the Farmers. How's your week going? How are you?
I'm really good. You covered a lot of things there.
Start with cheese. Where does your interest and intrigue in cheese come from, do you reckon?
So I grew up as a in a family whose history was grocer shops. So my nana had grocer shops in the 50s and 60s, and she had a small chain of grocers in the northwest, about 9 shops in total in her heyday. And part of that was that they sold cheeses, and they sold a huge diversity of cheese, which was Lancashire or Wensleydale. And that was pretty much the sum total of her cheese offer. And then when the imports really opened up from, after the Second World War, she sort of spun out to Canadian cheddar. So, it's Canadian cheddar, Lancashire or Wensleydale was the offer as part of her grocery range. And so that meant that my father, when he was in his 20s, ended up taking on market stalls that they had that were sort of ran alongside these shops. And he ended up taking one arm, which was the sort of cheese stalls, if you like, that then expanded to become, in the 70s, a huge array of cheese was coming in from the continent and in from Europe. And he got really excited about selling this cheese on market stalls. So he would attend Milnthorpe or Kendal market with, up to, I think he brags it was, up to 500 or 1,000 types of cheese on display or something like that. But, a huge array of cheeses that a lot of people probably would never have seen or heard of. And he got excited about that cheese business and selling it.
Okay.
Now, the supermarkets devastated that and kind of destroyed that business. And he sort of tried to adapt, but found it increasingly difficult. And somehow ended up going to agricultural shows and game fairs and big sort of country events, and traveling much further than the local area. So he'd go up and down the country and even up to Scotland to stand these big events where they'd get a lot of people in for a day or two, and he'd stand and sell this huge range of cheese. And as a teenager, like 12 or 13 years old, I started going with him and hanging out at these events and selling this cheese. And at that time, the only cheese he really could sort of sell at a decent profit was the sort of rejects and downgrades from the supermarkets. So he would get the Kirkhams Lancashire that was too sharp for, the sort of the Lancashire graders, or he would get the cheddar that was too blue for the cheddar graders in Somerset, and as the supermarkets dominated and started to it kind of constrict what cheesemakers could send them, and started to really hone in on I guess what they would perceive as quality, there was all this reject cheese floating around, and my dad realized he could buy that cheap and he could take it to markets and he could sell it for more margin, and he could sell something the supermarkets didn't have. And I was just around at that time whilst he was doing it. So as a teenager, I got all this amazing, weird and wonderful and abstract cheeses that were like blue Lancashire and, Dorset blue Vinny that would like sort of make your hair on the back of your head stand up, that was so strong or whatever. And so I got into that when I was 12 or 13. But he'd say to me, taste it out to the customers, because they'd say, oh, that cheddar's full of blue cracks. You can't, I can't, I'm not paying that for that. And he'd say, well, taste it. And they'd taste it and go, bloody hell, that's the best cheddar I've eaten. And then he'd go, how much is it? And he'd say, oh, it's a bit more than usual, and he'd charge extra for it. And they buy it because they tasted it and they were engaged in it. And he would talk about the producers, the farmers he bought them off. And I guess that just infected me at an early age, with this sort of passion or enthusiasm. But the thing that got me, it wasn't so much my dad's spiel or even turn up to these events and the enthusiasm, because it was the fact that everybody tasted something different. So you'd give people a piece of cheese and somebody would say, oh, it's too salty, it's too blue, it's too sharp. Oh, I like it like that. Oh, it's just how I want it, And it was this understanding that every cheese has a different customer or a different person. So there's no good or bad cheese, right? There's just cheese that, that people want to eat. And you can have 3 people taste the same batch of cheese, and they'll all have a different opinion on what they just tasted. And it still blows me away now if I taste cheese with customers. And I've been fortunate to stand with, what are regarded as the world's sort of, cheese professionals or best people in cheese or whatever, the real experts in this. And they stand there and they all taste it and they all, taste different things and think different. And it blows me away still now. So it makes it a great, interesting subject. So when I went home after these summer holidays spent trailing around selling cheese out of a trailer or off a market stall, of course, when I went home, because the family were in cheese, although my mum and dad were divorced, the sort of attic room was full of old books on cheese. And, my uncle, who used to work on the markets, now and then didn't, I'd end up chatting to him and he'd be like, oh, when we sold cheese, God, it was good fun. And so weirdly, I'd come away from it and then have this downtime where I could immerse myself in sort of cheese theory or there'd be books like Patrick Rance's book and World Atlas on cheese. And, so it was 14-year-old bored kid in my bedroom. I'd just read and look at it and thought, yeah, I'm into this. I like it. And of course, then opportunities opened up because someone would say, oh, Martin's quite interested in cheese. Oh, well, we'll just stop off here and we'll meet these guys who are making it. And they go, oh, hello, Peter, do you want to come buy some cheese? And so I kind of was fortunate enough to be in this position where having shown interest, I could learn about it. And it wasn't so abstract. 14 or 15, I probably fully understood, the sort of basic principles of cheese. You get milk, you starter, rennet, which probably a lot of people don't, I guess. So it made it something that was always there. And so when I went to work with my dad as a butcher, when I left school, he was butchering and selling meat down at red breed, pork and things like that down at Borough Market in London. So I joined in with him, was going to these farmers markets. And of course, inevitably, I'd be stood next to cheesemakers and I'd chat to them and I'd find it fascinating and they would share knowledge or information exchange with me. And there was just a good supportive kind of crowd around me. Who sort of probably fostered it and encouraged the interest. So when I left working with my dad, I literally, picked up my sort of shoes and apron and headed to the Kirkhams and walked straight into a job. I think I said to Graham, you offered me a job. Is it available? He said, yeah. And I said, when can I start? And he said, well, if you put that apron on, you can start now. So there was a sort of sense that there was always going to be a job in cheese for me.
Yeah, in some ways it was always meant to be. It was always going to happen at some point. Without getting too geeky about farmhouse cheeses, do you have any specific farmhouse cheeses that you remember when you were growing up or you remember sort of tasting or since, I suppose, as well, and any particulars that sort of wow.
As you said, I'm a northerner. I grew up in Lancashire, but my it's funny. So cheese changes, right, over time. People's like cheese shifts as cheesemakers have different values or ideas or scale or practices or requirements for their customers. Their cheese will change over time. And so there's a great quote I like to use, and it's the dial moves, the dial stirs yet none perceive it move, right? And it's so true in cheesemaking that little changes happen over time. like a sundial, and nobody sees it. But actually, when you look back, you go, "Oh, look, it's not the same cheese as it was," right? So you might have a memory of a cheese that 20 years ago you go, "God, I love that cheese," and then you come back and taste it 20 years later, and it's nothing like it. It's changed or transformed or transitioned to something different. But when I was growing up, Sandham's Lancashire was the Lancashire cheese of choice in our house, and that was all I understood was Lancashire cheese. That was the Lancashire cheese, and every other Lancashire I put near it never tasted that interesting. Of course, my first experience of the Kirkhams Lancashire was these wild, out of control farm-made things that my dad had bought cheap, But my mum would buy good quality, top of the notch Sandhams. So I grew up eating Sandhams and thinking that was the real Lancashire cheese for me. But then when I went to work when I stood next to the Kirkhams at farmers markets and started tasting different batches and diversity and different, I realized there was more complexity to that cheese than I'd understood. And then obviously went to make it and spent time on the farm eating it at breakfast, dinner, and lunch, and tasting it. So real affinity for Kirkham's farmhouse Lancashire cheese. But then again, time moves on. When you're tasting something every day, when you're privy to tasting every batch, that changes your perspective on the cheese. There's a real a sense for me that cheese changes, and the dynamic and how closely related you are to it, I think, does affect your senses. You taste things differently.
Fascinating. This episode is being supported by our primary sponsor, A-Plan Rural. Why did I want to collaborate with A-Plan Rural? Well, having got to know them, their team shares my passion for giving a voice to farmers, and we are both driven to raise the profile of farming voices to a wider audience. So it seemed quite a good fit. Quite frankly, together we will be able to do a lot more. A-Plan Rural do a lot of work on social media themselves, sharing farming accounts and farming stories. They have a rural community blog which shares farmers' experiences, and they also support a growing number of initiatives that champion UK farmers, including this podcast. So a big thank you to A-Plan Rural for supporting Meet the Farmers. Let's talk about a bit about where you are. So you're on the edge of the lake. Tell us about where you are in Cumbria.
Yeah, so we are so the Cartmel Peninsula. So that puts us just outside Cartmel Valley. We are effectively sea level. A little village called Fluteborough or Carkin Cartmel or Cartmel. Cartmel's become well known for Longclume. Simon Rogan, the very famous 3 Michelin star chef, our next door neighbour. He's sort of 2 miles up the road. He does amazing things. We're fortunate enough. I think St James definitely owes some credit to being on Simon Rogan's menu. Or being on the cheese board, should we say, for a good 10 or 15 years. So a long time we've been selling cheese, and it's been appearing on his cheese board and having his sommeliers and front of house waxing lyrical about the virtues of their local cheese. So I think that means that we've been in the minds of lots of chefs over the years. Like do a stage, or people that come and do a stint at the front of house and then move to open another restaurant. So I think that's given us definitely a place on fine dining. Part of our success, I guess, or exposure for being such a small scale cheese is that we've been on the cheese board for these 2-3 Michelin star restaurants now for a good period of time. So I think that it's been helpful having him up the road for sure.
Yeah. And tell us about the farm itself. So you mostly sheep, but you also now have goats as well.
Yeah, so we were 20 acres, and then just literally the year of COVID, we'd signed a new tenancy to expand us to 70 acres, and that happened in January 2020, and then we obviously had COVID March 2020, but we suddenly expanded our grazing, and yet we had no sales for cheese. So we suddenly sort of going, we haven't got any cheese, but we've got this grazing, and we've been grazing 20 acres. And trying to grow our numbers of sheep without really understanding how we're going to manage, where we were going to grow to, but trying to secure and source more grazing locally. So we were sort of ready to push the sheep numbers up, or we had pushed the sheep numbers up in expectation of this new land. But when COVID hit, we suddenly didn't need all this milk. So we sort of effectively, I like to refer to it, we kicked the sheep out. We pretty much moved them out of the shed and went to a really extensive system because we had loads of grazing and not much demand for cheese. So we're like, okay, let's see if we can, be way more extensive. It was thankfully just at the start of the season when COVID kicked in. So we ended up with a lot of sheep outdoors that would have been sort of part in the shed and part outside. So lots of empty space in the shed. In the sheds, and that gave us an idea that we could take on a herd of goats. We didn't. Right. We had considered it a year before when Mary Holbrook passed. Her goats came up for sale, But at the time, we just weren't ready for it, and we didn't have the space, and for one thing or another. So the idea had been sort of there, but we weren't ready to do it. So a year later, when we spoke to Joe and Amy Bennett, who were making Innis cheese, they told us they'd decided to make the decision to pack up and that their goats would be for sale. And we've been talking to them about buying some equipment from them. But when we went to look at the equipment, there was just this sort of niggling idea that maybe we should buy the goats and make some of the cheese making. So we, rightly or wrongly, we decided in the middle of COVID we'd do that. But the decision they'd made was from their own personal reasons had to be quite quick. So they sort of had made the decision that basically were like, in 6 weeks' time there'll be no goats on the farm. So by the time we'd heard about it and made our decision, there was like sort of 3 weeks for us to accommodate 300 goats, or as many as we'd like. So not knowing how many of those goats or which ones we wanted, we bought them all and virtually all the contents of their dairy and equipment and moved them to Holker Farm. And they were being milked in the morning and they got milked in the evening, in Staffordshire, and they got milked in the evening at Holker Farm, on the day they were all sort of arrived and delivered. And it was chaos, I have to say. It was absolute carnage. But the kids weren't at school because it was COVID and the customers weren't ringing us up. So we kind of felt like we had all this extra time and sort of
it's probably the best time to do it.
Yeah, exactly. There was a sense that we had the time and the space and the mental energy to do it because we weren't doing anything else. So we took them on, and the intention was we would make hard cheeses with it, sort of experimental hard cheese that we could put on the shelf for a few months, and then of course COVID would be over in September. And things would return back to normal, and we would make little lactic goat cheeses. So obviously, 2 years later, the world's still it's never going back, is it? But I mean, COVID never really finished, so we never actually got into the soft cheese production until a year and a half later, before we really started trialing the little lactic soft cheeses, which is what we bought them for. And I have to say that Ingot, which is a play on words, because the Innis brick was one of their cheeses, and we're making it here, so we decided we'd call it Ingot because they're like a little ingot gold brick. So we started making Ingot in 2021, late 2021, and I would say we're getting them to the point where we want them now, and we're in March 2023. So that's been a much more sort of extended, longer, sort of exaggerated play than we thought it would be. We thought we'd be further on a bit sooner, if that makes sense. But it's been interesting because we've had all this goat's milk to worry about, to think about. We've had time to accommodate the goats to the farm. A lot of the original goats that came have probably gone now, but they'd sort of started breeding towards a smaller, sort of more mixed breed goat, a golden Guernsey cross. So they're like a dark, sort of haired coloured, horned goat that's quite small in frame and not overly productive in terms of milk yield, but like really good, thick, rich constituents in the milk. And we've transitioned to a lot of those. So we've got a lot of these smaller, sort of what I'd call, crossbred goats. That's the bulk of the herd now. So whereas when they came, it was still sort of partly a commercial herd with these sort of new, smaller animals being mixed in, if you like. They were like, I think they were 3 years into a program to sort of shift that herd into a more cheesemaker herd, if you like. So it's good because 2 years on, that's what our main herd is comprised of, these little neat, kind of golden Guernsey cross goats, which is what we wanted.
Just bringing this back onto the cheese again. When the goats come on, I'm just fascinated with the sort of, when you're designing a new cheese, when you're coming up with a concept for a new cheese, how creative is it? How scientific is it? How do you go about that? And do, again, not knowing anything about it at all, I love eating cheese, but that's about as much as my cheese knowledge goes. Would different goat's milk react differently? Therefore, how does it work? Just in very simple terms, talk me through the process.
So, I mean, I've heard it described as cheesemaking as an art, and I don't particularly like that. I've heard it described as a science, and I don't particularly like that either. And I think the best description, it's a craft. So the craft is sort of like somewhere between art and science. You've got to understand both ends of it. You've got to appreciate the artistry of producing something really special, for the kind of cheeses we make anyway. Something really beautiful, one-off tasting flavor, but also you've got to understand how that works behind the scenes, like the acidity, the salt, the moisture, what's going on there. So I think that's a good description. In terms of setting about creating a new cheese, how can I put it? If every cheese in the world, you begin with milk, starter cultures, rennet, and salt. That's everything from Parmesan to, the freshest cheese you can think of. They're all somewhere on the spectrum. So it is very much in the hands of the cheesemaker what you can do to develop a recipe. That said, there's certain things about like animals and character and what's in the milk in the first instance, which is what
Yeah.
my Nuffield took me on. Was the question really I posed for my Nuffield was what makes great milk, right? If you want to make great cheese and you talk to cheesemakers, they go, well, the thing is we've got great milk, that's why our cheese is great, you know. And I went around cheese
But what's the grey milk?
to different farms and going, so what is it? And they were like, well, the thing is we've just got great milk, you know. I was like, great. And I realized they're all producing milk differently, different cows, different herds, different farms, and they would never agree on any one thing. You find farmers who can agree on what great milk is, and you can have an award. But there is this sense that what is great milk for cheese making. But I guess what I've
So
learned,
I'm literally going to ask every on the
yeah,
Clipe podcast. I'm going to ask every farmer who comes on that question now. What is great milk?
it's
It's a
great
great
milk.
question.
That was my and it was. Of course, it's a question that even after all these years, I'm still not sure I can answer. But what I came to was. Looking at like the grazing systems. So you can have a extensive grazing system, and you can't put a herd of 200 Holsteins out onto a hillside with the most extensive grazing system and expect those cows to produce any sort of milk or even probably survive. To be honest, so you realise that dairy animals have to be adapted to the kind of system, the farming systems where they are presented. So if you are in on a big flat land in I don't know, Cheshire or whatever, and there's lots of arable around you, you can have big, high yielding, milky cows that will produce off whatever the cheapest feed stock is that's on hand, right? But if you're up some hillside in Wales or Cumbria or Scotland, and it rains and the road up your track is 5 miles long, and when you get to the end of it, it's just a farmyard, with a river running through the middle of it. The idea that you're going to import lots of cheap surplus food into that system and feed it to high yielding cows, it's kind of nuts, right? So you go, the good farming systems are ones that are suited to their surroundings, their climate. So I suppose that means that good milk comes from animals that are, that support their system around them too, right? Because you've got animals that can make use of whatever it is. So, but then you look at that, you go, that means the species of animals is really key to the farming system. So then you realize that different animals do produce different milk. So it's not that a dairy shorthorn's milk is any better than a Holstein cow's milk. It's just that you're never going to be able to produce the same milk from a Holstein cow that you will from a dairy shorthorn if you put that dairy shorthorn in the right place. So it's this idea that actually there's loads of different systems for producing milk, and what makes better milk is your end customer, what that milk's designed for, where it's going, I guess. So if you want to make complex, interesting cheeses with diversity of flavour, and you want to do it sustainably in the Lake District, you're gonna probably need an old-fashioned breed of cow, with a farmer who's got a keen eye on conservation, or a small breed of goat that's going to be able to be nimble and is going to be able to walk around the rocky, sort of limestone of Holker estates and in and out of the woodlands. These are things that we need to accommodate. So, but of course, there's always compromise because people are looking for yield. They've got bills to pay. So there's this sense that like the direction of travel is we want to get the best milk we can from the farm where we are. And so that's I guess for us, we looked at goats. We didn't want to have big, high yielding, white sort of dairy Saanen goats that were going to produce 8 litres of milk a day, because we wouldn't be able to feed them. We wouldn't know where to buy the feed. We wouldn't be able to source it. It's like we want goats that might produce less, but perhaps they can do it from grazing, the hedgerows and the verges and the woodlands around our farm. So that was for us why we were excited by the sort of breeding program of the Innis goats, because they were going in the direction of travel that we wanted. Our sheep are Lacan sheep, so all right, they originate from Aviron.
Okay.
But they're keen grazers. They've got strong, hardy feet. For a milking sheep breed, they're about as strong on their feet as you'll get. And that matters to us because they're walking around sort of pasture soils. They're in and out of gateways. So you need a sort of a resilience in this animal. So that was something that we looked at, with some of the fact that they can make the most from pasture. Again, they're not just going to have to shovel lots of bought-in feed into them. Again, because of our location, there is no giant bakery business or brewery business down the road that we can import loads of cheap feedstock from. So that means that we have to make it from pasture, right? And that pasture is diverse and it's fairly seasonal. So our system is suited to that. So I suppose the question of what is great milk, and then the question is, well, is this going to make the best cheese though, becomes the question. So we started looking at systems that were making really great cheese. So I went to visit Andy Hatch up in Wisconsin. And he's this unknown dairy farmer in Wisconsin. Internationally in cheese, he's so well known and respected, makes phenomenal cheese, world-class cheeses, right? And his farming system, Scotty, who runs the farm, is just run amazing sort of New Zealand sort of focus, but with a lot of sort of herbaceous herbal lays and things like that going on. Lots of stuff going on. Really clever farming. And in Wisconsin, the bar down the road were like, who? And they knew every farmer, but they didn't know Andy had. He was so different and so outlandish that they were like, oh, we just thought that land had been abandoned, like relatively like huge, big sort of soy and corn crops, monocultures that were going around them. But you looked at his cheese was amazing, the flavor was there, but the diversity in the sward, the type of cows they were keeping meant that they could graze those animals, move them around. Really, to me, they were making the most of their farm, for animals. And it comes through in the quality. But of course, give the best milk to someone, and if the cheesemaker's not focused, they're not always going to make the best cheese, right? So there's a sort of point where, going back to how do you design a cheese, it needs to be achievable by the people who are making it, I suppose, and the skills at the skill level. We're going to struggle to compete with the French in terms of quality lactic style goat's cheeses. It's always going to be a struggle. It's like I'm sure someone like Stacey at Tunworth will attest that it's been a challenge to compete with the French to make a camembert style cheese, when there's people in Normandy make 10 times as much as her, and they're still described as artisan and small scale. So there's a sense that it makes sense in some respects to make cheddar if you're in Somerset, because that's the home of that. That's where you're going to find skills and attributes. But in Cumbria, we don't have a cheesemaking history really, or if we did, it's gone such a long time ago. So we've got a sense that we can be quite flexible, we can play around, but we're never going to be able to produce something to the specialized, sort of like industrial quality of something like a camembert or something like that. So St. James was this fluid idea. When we began with St. James, we said, let's just let the milk express what it does, make something that we're interested in, styles of cheese we like to eat, styles of cheese that for us get us excited, something that really gives a lot of flavor out, especially when it's young, because we're new farmers and cheesemakers, we don't have a lot of cash flow. So St. James was born out of necessity, like, let's just make some cheese that's interesting to us and sell it, and we'll see where the cheese goes. So there's a real sort of fluid kind of angle to it. And 15 years later, we still start the season. We're like, right, how do we want this to begin? How do we want the season to start? What the kind of cheese is? And we'll talk about, what time of year is it? How far are we from Easter? What's the demand looking like? Who's excited about it? Who's going to open with a bang and really shout about St. James? And that'll affect, how quickly the cheese is mature in the earliest sense. How many sheep we've actually lambed, how much cheese have we got to sell in that first month? If we've got a lot of cheese to sell, maybe we're not going to sell all the first month's cheese straight out the bat. So maybe we make it just keep a little bit longer. But if we know that, well, the first cheeses are sold the minute they hit the scales, then there's a sense that we can make something that ripens a bit faster, it's a bit more oozing, a bit more flowing. So we do sort of play around with St. James. It is, it's the idea is it's an expression of our milk on any one given day at one time of year. We make 7 days a week. So there is I would say there's minimal design in that process. We didn't set about to make a sort of a cheese there. Now with other cheese like the Ingot, we have a kind of an idea in our head of what that cheese should be. It should be a lactic style. It should be 240 grams. It should be a nice neat geotrichum rind, preferably with not too many blue spots on the outside. It should be sort of creamy and yogurty in the center of the paste, and it should be breaking down on the edge without running and with the rinds falling off. So the sense that we have an idea and a vision for that, and it's probably more sort of, I guess, more typical of what people would think of as a goat's cheese, and it's probably more defined. So that makes it more challenging to hit that, because we've got to work that bit harder. We can't just say, well, it is what it is, So our frustration with that cheese, we don't hit what if you set out a clear vision of what you should be making, then of course there's lots of frustration goes with that, where you go, well, it's not what we said we'd make. So whereas with St. James is kind of like, hey, that's good. It's nothing like we made before, but we like it, so we can sell it. Whereas that wasn't the case with some of these other cheeses we're looking at. So so designing a cheese, what you're going to do. You've got the milk you've got, like I say, you've got the quantity of milk you have available, or how special, how rare and unusual is that milk, I guess. So those things play, like if we make the weirdest, most expensive cheese in the world, fine. Are we going to sell any of it? Who's going to buy it? Where are we going to send it to?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think then it just comes to basic tools. As a cheesemaker, you play with acidity, starter culture, salt, moisture, like how you work the vat and temperature in the vat. So there's a sort of I'd say a sort of mechanical or sort of driven, like an understood process to how to make a soft cheese versus how to make a hard cheese. Yep. That comes with learning and cheese making experience. So, and that's what we play with. Also, what tools have we got? If we can't press because we don't have a cheese press, then we might skirt around and make a cheese slightly differently. Whereas we might go, we'd like it to be hard. Well, we can't press it because we don't have cheese presses. So maybe we make it a hard cheese slightly differently. So, knowing what tools fun,
I
isn't
think
it?
that insight is that's really interesting. We'll go on to talk about your Nuffield, but it does run. It rather feels like, which might even be the there's so many titles I could name this podcast, but yeah, other than moving around the businesses of the cheesemakers, but it sounds a bit like the quest of the Holy Grail. It's like what is the best milk in the world?
Yeah, I mean that I think that's what it became after going to different farms. I ended up shortening that title. I thought this is what it's about. It's so the prevalence and importance of indigenous microbial communities was about my understanding that raw milk makes the best cheese. Right, that's how I was driven. Like raw milk,
Yep,
it's got to be raw milk. That's the best
yep.
cheese. And then you go, I've tasted some pretty average raw milk cheeses, and I've tasted some really great pasteurized cheeses. So you go, well, maybe it's not just that, but actually, yeah, by and large, what's going on at a microbial level in that cheese makes it to me makes it really interesting. And I think that's where I was at in my point of my learning was I really wanted to get to grips with what made good raw milk cheese great, and what we could do on our farm to increase the quality or improve the quality of our raw milk. So if you said about the idea that raw milk means that you're not going to pasteurize the milk before you make cheese, all the microbes that come from the farm on the animal's teat surface or the udder or that are on the farm or in the air, they're going to end up in your cheese, right? So that's great. And that's raw milk, that's diversity. But then how do you make sure that you're farming to get the best ones present, right? Because I
Mm,
suppose at time, as you might improve your milking parlour, you go, we put a new milking parlour in, we put a new teat cleaning procedure in, we've concreted a yard outside, like various different things that farmers just do, right? They do it because they're improving their farm or their working practices or whatever. But how much of that then goes against this notion of diversity or microbial diversity in the milk? And it was understood if my worry was that we see improvement or progress, and as you try and improve or progress, you actually sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. You lose the essence of what made a cheese special. And it was for me trying to understand how could we grow our business and evolve our business forwards and not lose the thing that made our raw milk special. So what did I need to do was what the question I was posing, really, to be able to
yeah.
expand and to grow from the scale where we are, but without losing the thing that made it special. And also to be able to share that information and talk with some certainty when other cheesemakers ask me the same question, what does it matter? What does it mean? So that was driving enough. But I realized at the end of it, I just ended up talking to people and saying, I just want to know how farming affects cheese. Right. And they go, oh, right. Okay. That makes sense. Because most people just like their eyes would glaze over when I told them what I wanted to know. But in the end, I realized that's what it was actually. How does farming affect cheese? And it taught me a lot of lessons about, somebody might make raw milk cheese for, a long period of time. And then suddenly they go, we've got a scale and my son wants to be in the business or this wants to, or we've, the farm down the road's come up for sale. So we're making cheese less often. So we're pasteurizing it now. And that's enabled us to cut our resources, or somebody died and then we had nobody to do that delivery run. So we realized, you realize that the whole farm actually has an influence. It's too simplistic to just say, oh, everyone should make with raw milk all the time, and then you should just be able to grow that, because it's a real sort of devotion to make raw milk cheese. It takes a lot of control, and not all farms are suitably scaled to exact that control on their milk at all times. So there's a sense that sometimes pasteurized milk made better cheeses because there wasn't the attention to detail in certain areas, or actually maybe the attention was there. Simply they didn't have the labor to make cheese 7 days a week or 6 days a week. And I met people who'd made this sort of, in my mind, huge compromise, because they had this awesome milk that would have been ideal for raw milk cheese. And they'd say, yeah, but we just make cheese 3 days a week. And it's pasteurized because we're storing the milk up. And sometimes we only make 1 or 2 days a week. And I was going, this awesome raw milk that's so special. And they were like, yeah, but, we've got 2 young kids and so-and-so has to manage it. And then I'd meet the cheesemaker and they're like, yeah, I've got a life too. And I have to work on this farm. And, I go to the farmer's market and I sell it, and that's part of my job. And I can't be at the market and in the dairy. And so there was a realize that actually there's a ton of smart moves where it meant that people were going, yeah, we make what I would have called compromises, but really they weren't. They were just business decisions or business decisions, or even farming decisions that, it's harvest. We don't want to be in the dairy 7 days a week when we're trying to make hay. We'd rather just bulk that milk up and make 2 days, and make something different for those 2 days. And that, I think, I feel like my Nuffield gave me permission to come back and make changes to my cheesemaking business that served my farming better, rather than before. I was very driven, as you can tell, very passionate about cheese. I felt there was certain standards and compromises I couldn't make in my cheesemaking business because that would be like selling out or compromising. And of course, when I looked more closely, all the compromises are at the farm level. They were me not going to a farming conference to learn about something, or they were me not going to, like say, cart bales on the right day when I should have been, or subcontracting out farm work to other people that I should have been doing myself. So there was there was a sense that my Nuffield was really useful for me to give me. It felt like it gave me permission to do things my way, and to not beat myself up if I made sort of so-called compromises.
While we're on the Nuffield, can you tell us the story of the cheesemaking nun? I can't even remember where I heard this story, but I want to hear it again from you.
The US is where I'd seen all of the research coming from. So whilst there's a lot of research in Spain, France, Europe, I felt like they were on my doorstep. So I'd go to the US first, learn what I could there, come back, and then follow up in Europe. The timing of my Nuffield, when I came back to do my European end of it, the European end of it ended up being COVID year. So I didn't get to do as much travel in Europe as I had. But being close proximity to Europe, we get a lot of this research anyway, or you get to hear a certain amount of it. But the US stuff I found interesting. They were studying cheese microbes at Harvard. They were looking at things in a very different way. So I went out and spent time with a company, Jasper Hill Cellars, and they offered to actually sort of put me up for a few weeks whilst I spent time in their caves and cellars. But I used Vermont as a sort of off point, so to move around. And as I was traveling around the US, certain people's names cropped up and certain ideas, and I'd sort of come across this idea of Sister Noella, and she is a nun who makes in a wooden cheese vat. So part of my microbial studies were about how wood can be used in cheese making, because wood actually can be used in cheesemaking process, but it's not commonly used in commercial dairy, certainly not in the UK or not at all, really. But yet there was a lot of work done on wooden shelves and how wooden shelves have been good for cheese, good for maturation. Under the Food Safety Modernization Act under Obama, there was a big sort of recall of cheeses who were stored on wooden boards. And as a result, the international cheese community came together to prove the science of how cheese could be stored on wooden boards. So there was this sort of, that had happened before my Nuffield, but it had highlighted the importance and the value of wood in terms of preserving microbes in the cheese facility and premises, and how they could be safe if managed correctly, and actually even improve safety in some cases because they're already inoculated with the right molds and yeast. So the wood idea had been interesting, but there's parts of France and Italy where they actually use wooden cheese vats. So that's putting raw milk straight into a wooden cheese vat, and it's what's impregnated in the wall of the vat. Even after cleaning, the microbes that remain actually become the starter culture for the next batch of milk. So this was commonplace again in Sicily, Sardinia, and it's commonplace in the south of France where they make Salaise cheese traditionally like this in wooden girls. But again, in sort of the US and the UK, this is a long way from what's seen as practical or even safe. So having heard that Sister Noella was making this cheese in a wooden vat in a convent, and also that Dennis D'Amico at University of Connecticut had been studying the vat and had done some research on it, I made the time to visit Connecticut to talk with Dennis D'Amico, and he Sister Noella afforded me the time to go and spend a night in the farmhouse next to the convent, and go and visit her nuns, where they were milking these sort of Dutch belted black and white cows and making cheese from milk every day in a little wooden vat, a little cheese she calls Bethlehem, and then she stores it in a little cellar under the convent and matures them. But the amazing thing is this nun, who was in her 70s, had done a PhD in microbiology as part of her she'd gone away to do it, and had studied and referenced and catalogued every strain of Geotrichum that she could find in the south of France, in the Auvergne region. So she'd been to the Auvergne where they make Saint Nectaire, and she'd studied Geotrichum, and she catalogued and referenced them. And then she'd come back and was making this cheese in her cellar. So this completely abstract authority on cheese, exists and lives in a
fantastic.
Very gracious, very sharing with her information, very inspiring. One of the great bits of that, of the whole thing, the most memorable part, which is kind of embarrassing actually, how childlike my brain is, was she just sat me on a stool in what had been the convent sort of schoolroom. She sat me on a stool and had me looking at cheese mite, the little crawling cheese mite, under a microscope, and I was just sort of sat there like a child, just like sort of awestruck, going, what am I doing here? I'm in a convent with a nun looking at cheese mites under a microscope for the first time in my career. I was actually looking at them moving around. And again, for a cheese nerd like me, that was just amazing. But I think that it reminds you that, for all the science, all the enthusiasm, all the technical stuff, like it's a living, breathing product, cheese, and it comes from our soils, it comes from our farming, and it's easy to get excited about taste, flavor. It's a real thing, right? It's something we can all engage in at any level. There's something for everyone in cheese.
just a little more about our primary sponsor, A Plan Rural. They provide bespoke insurance cover for farms and estates. This could be for anything from tractors and machinery to a new exciting diversification venture. So for more information, visit aplan.co.uk/rural. That's aplan.co.uk/rural. Let's mention Nicola, because very, very much about her as well. You met at school. So, I mean, when did her cheese interest start? Was it as a direct result as you? Was it that romantic?
Nicola was into animals, I guess. She just loved animals, always wanted to work with animals, I think we both left school, didn't really sort of finish up our studies. We're kind of we're both a bit childlike in our approach to stuff. We like things and if something makes us laugh or something, if we want to do something, we want to do something. So the idea of let's move to Somerset, milk goats and make cheese, we were like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And Nicola was like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. So there's a sense that we've just followed what we wanted to do. And it's not easy, doing what we do. We farm, we run a business, we employ staff. We've been through a pandemic now. Now we're going through, price hikes of all the commodities. All our inputs are going through the roof. What we do is really difficult. But I suppose it's there's some people who are just unemployable. And I would say that Nicola and I fit in that category of we are unemployable. We like to follow our passions and whatever interests us. That's what you'll find us doing generally, is following up on stuff that we're interested in. So the animals drove Nicola and I. We were at a slight disagreement on the goats. Personally, I would have liked to work with other farmers who produce milk and really use our strength as cheesemakers, which is what we've been doing more recently. We work with James Robinson, who's a organic dairy farmer where we buy cow's milk from, who's just up the road from us. I wanted to do more of that, but Nicola wanted more animals. So we ended up with the goats. The compromise was that as long as Nicola committed to never doing an evening milking, so that we would have a team work with us to do the milking, just so that it didn't completely consume our lives. Milking 200 animals, so that was the sort of compromising deal. Goats were driven largely by Nicola's interest in animals and that side of things. So we've been such a long time together. We moved around together. People know me in the business partly because I tend to incline more on the social media, on Instagram and Twitter. They were set up in my name, so it'll be Martin Gott, St. James Cheese, but it's not really, it's not massive ego-centric, kind of maniac. It's just actually because that's how they got set up. So people do kind of associate me with St. James, but Nicola's, she's the business.
Definitely both of you.
Yeah.
Let's sort of fill in a little bit more of the story. I'm just interested in your time, I suppose, when you were learning, so both in Lancashire and in Somerset as well. Can you just pull out some of the sort of highlights from that time?
Yeah, I mean, Lancashire was great because it was a cheesemaking job, So I was keen to learn about the farming aspect of it. So whilst my dad kept pigs, I had no practical experience of dairy farming. So the Kirkhams was a great place for me to go to. And at that point, they were still making a very small dairy that was almost like an annex to the house. It was just across the yard from a farmhouse, and all the farm, Ruth Kirkham and John Kirkham, would sit down for breakfast with me and Graham Kirkham, and it was very much just a family farm that made cheese. And whilst I was there, they were transitioning to building a new dairy, which I think probably professionalised something that was due to happen as well. But also, as John and Ruth were heading towards retirement age, inevitably, they don't. I don't know if they wanted to or not, but the whole farm would sit down to have breakfast in their kitchen. Maybe they were getting to a point where there would have to be some separation. So I was there at a time, for me, I think that was really useful for me, because I got to understand a lot more about farming than I would on any other cheesemaking job. If I'd gone to work in a dairy, and if I'd gone to work at the Kirkhams now, I'd be in the dairy, likely not in the farm kitchen, talking about the quality of the silage or the weather or what the cows are doing today. Partly because of my interest, I guess, practical nature. I would get involved where I could, when the time allowed. I'd get involved with, a bit of silage making and, moving dry cows and unloading straw or whatever. So I kind of was right in the way that situation was. I was kind of at the heart, in the center of their business, to be able to see enough of what was going on around me. So that helped me hugely, because I got to understand dairy farming. I got to do some milking. I got to do bits of all the sort of farm jobs and see it from overview, but wasn't deep in it, and it wasn't my responsibility by any stretch. So it was a good entry sort of into the industry, and made a lot of cheese. I made cheese 6 days a week for 18 months or whatever, fairly long shifts. I really enjoyed it. It was a great place for me to learn, great place for me to get into cheesemaking, and honestly, I think it helped cement my sort of love and passion of the cheesemaking industry, the people that came through that farm, the positivity around that farm and that business and the people in it, whether it be customers or the family themselves. It was just a really good entry point into the industry, I think. I realized that being there, I wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to set up my own cheesemaking business, and I realized that it was almost too comfortable being at the Kirkhams. I could still be there now. If I lived down the road, I probably would be. I'd have just, just pottering around in the back of the cheese room at Kirkhams and being quite content about it. But there was a sense.
Oh, there's Martin.
Yeah, I was just a bit probably too content, really, for a young sort of guy with ambition. So I saw a need to do something on my own. We looked at buying milking sheep and setting up nearby. And then bizarrely, through a chance meeting, I took some time off and, of course, went to visit cheesemakers with my time off, with my week's holiday. And I went to visit Charles Martel down in Gloucester. I went to visit Mary Holbrook and Charlie Westhead. And it was Mary's farm that it just got me thinking and inspired me about how different it was. She was a cheesemaker who didn't even have a cheese vat. There was just tubs and tanks of milk, just kind of pottering around in a dairy, which after being stood at a cheese vat, sort of every day at the Kirkhams for a year or whatever, it suddenly occurred to me like, hey, there's another way of doing this that's different again. And so when I came back, I kept in touch with Mary, and she basically told me that she was going to pack up the farm and sell it because she couldn't find anyone to make cheese and milk her goats. And I just came back and was like, this awesome farm, out of the way in the middle of nowhere with all this cool stuff going on. And again, a similar sort of positive vibe and energy to it, and I can't back up. Surely not. There's too much to learn there and too much going on. So I called her up and said, if I came and milked your goats and got involved with the cheese making, would you consider it? And have you got somewhere for us to live? And she said, yeah, you can live in the house with me, and start this week sort of thing. Same sort of thing. Start when you've worked your notice. So Nicola and I talked to Nicola about it. She liked the idea. We moved to Somerset, and then we began working with Mary, which was entirely different. But there, I think the funny thing was that we were like, this is Mary's farm and we're going to milk goats. And when we got there, she was like, right, I'm off to London now for for 4 weeks or whatever. And there was a sense we were like, okay, sink or swim. You're like, there's your goats, now you know how to milk them. You get on with it, So we were more than just sort of milkers. We basically got handed the job pretty instantly of like, here's some goats to manage and here's a farm to deal with. There you go. Which again was really useful because we both had loads of energy and enthusiasm. So we just took it as like, yeah, you give us some chance and some responsibility, we'll take it all. And to the point where 6 months later, I think the farm was just feeling and different, and I don't know, Mary sort of found it really inspiring and interesting again, and she was spending more and more time at the farm, which was really lovely initially, and then eventually it was like that initial responsibility and that full ownership we'd been given started to be eroded a little bit as Mary realized how much she enjoyed the farm herself, and suddenly we were back to we're sharing a farm or we're working for somebody again, and we'd almost had so much freedom in the early stages.
Yeah, you've had a taste of it.
Yeah, exactly that. Once we had a taste of it, and we realized again, we're like, okay, we're slowly coming back to the same point where we're still working for other people here, and working really hard for other people, and not to take anything away from that. We wanted to be in control of our own decisions and our own destinies or life, I guess, or whatever. So we started looking for places to move to, and by that point, it was established. And Mary had come to terms with the fact that she could have someone work for her. So we hired our own replacement, so somebody else came after us, and then somebody else came after that, and somebody else came after that, and actually over a period of the next 10 years or whatever, loads of people from the cheese business sort of followed us and spent stints working at Mary's and did a season or did 12 months and then went off and did their own thing.
Fantastic.
Or there is a league of cheesemakers and people out there who spent time at Mary's,
real training ground.
Yeah. So and I suppose maybe we opened the door for that to happen, or that's how I see it. We opened the door for it to happen, but it created again this opportunity, kept that business going, and kept her interested and inspired enough to keep teaching people. Because Mary did really, she taught people in her own way. I feel like she never gave me a lesson once, but every day she was teaching me something. I'd stand with her making cheese, and I'd try and watch her, and she'd almost wait till I left the room to do something, and I'd come back in. I'm like, "What did you do?" She'd be like, "Well, So there was a sense. It's always like she was difficult to learn from, but what I learned working with her, she was again, she was childlike, I would say, in her approach to business and life. She did stuff because she wanted to, because she thought it was a good idea. Certain degree of impulsiveness with the responsibility behind it, but there was a sense that, well, I'm doing that because I want to, because I think it's a good idea, and I've got permission to do it off myself, not nobody else. So she was fun to work, very inspiring.
just bringing this back to sheep. Um, how big is sheep dairying in the UK? It's, I mean, how many sort of businesses roughly are there? Do you know?
So Sheep's Milk UK is a local business that to us that sort of collects sheep's milk from other, from lots of sheep farms and then sells it on a kind of cooperative model. But I think that they handle about 4 or 5 million litres of milk a year, something like that. And I would say once you take that out of the equation, the rest smalls, is a small volume of milk. So they're tiny. Sheep's milk dairying is tiny relatively, but there is the sort of bones of an industry there. There is an industry milking sheep, but it's certainly less. I would say less than 50 farmers, milking sheep in. I think it's one of those things that's earmarked to grow as people have looked at alternatives to do different things with pasture. They suit system. For us, it was actually at the time when I started looking, you still had to buy milk quota to milk cows in the UK. So cows we looked at initially dairy shorthorns or other sort of rare breeds of cows or just alternative breeds. But actually at the time, milk quota was all the money we had. We'd have had to buy 5 grand of the quota, and we bought our first milk sheep flock for like 5 grand. So we made it an easy decision, and they were smaller. Nicola was more comfortable with them having that other background with cows, smaller ruminants, and again, Mary's opportunity created that opportunity for us to do sheep. Mary had sheep first for a lot of years, and then sold her sheep flock.
Right.
So we knew moving there that there was an opportunity to milk sheep. That was part of the deal. If we milked her goats, could we buy and start up a flock of sheep? And we had no cash. Nicola and I both worked. I worked as a butcher for my dad on less than minimum wage. Nicola worked in pubs and as a dental nurse for minimum wage. We saved a little bit of cash because we worked 2 jobs. And so we started in farming with no capital, no background, no family money. So there was a sense that we needed to get into something that was cheap. And when we moved to Mary's, we rented grazing by the week. She'd say, right, where there's some grass down there. Why don't you put your sheep there? And at the end of the week, she'd total what what we owed, and we'd pay her by the week, and we shared things like the feed. We'd buy her so many kilos of feed out of the feed hopper and pay her for that. So she gave us that start that that a lot of farmers' children get. Ironically, that's actually when you realise like my son now keeps belly Galloways on my farm, and I'm like trying to tot up what he owes me for grazing. I'll never get the money, but there's a sense that you get a permission to use the resource of the farm, right? But if you're not from a farming background, you're not on the family farm. You don't get that. I think that's a huge barrier for people getting in. So Mary sort of crossed that barrier by allowing us that opportunity at her farm.
What a lady!
Yeah.
I'm glad we've given her such a shout out. Actually, that's great. I'm loving it. We're going to have to start wrapping things up. Future. I mean, you've obviously got the goats, you've got your new cheeses. What does the future look like?
So yeah, we're doing a lot more cow's milk actually, because working with Strictly. So one of the things that came from my Nuffield was what is great milk, right? So after talking to these farmers, looking at systems, one of the things that did come up was, like species diversity in the pasture, allows for sort of more microbial diversity, and then when animals sit down in these species diverse pastures, the microbes get onto their teats, and so that they get onto the teat surface. Even the actual things that they're grazing, what are those amino acids, what are those proteins in those plants, and those things that go on to produce fats and fatty acids, they're different from a species diverse pasture than if you're feeding on a sort of conventional house system. So something that did come out of it, a little bit of certainty for me, was if you want really unique cheeses, when I say great milk, what is unique milk? So maybe great milk is unique milk. If you want to have unique milk, then these systems do allow for that. And after going around it and looking around the world, I came back and I was like, I know a farmer, up the road who's producing really good, really amazing quality cow's milk. And we looked to try and expand on our sheep's milk range by working with other farmers. But a lot of the farmers who maybe approached or we talked to, they were just getting into farming. They weren't established. They weren't sure whether they should be in a more intensive or extensive system. And I was like, there's a farmer up the road. He's 5 generations in. They milk dairy shorthorns on an organic system, and they're obsessed with conservation and hay meadows and species diversity. And I'm like, in my understanding, that is great milk up the road. And it was just going into the organic milk market in a tanker with everybody else's. So I approached James and got him excited about it. And then COVID interrupted it. But anyway, 2 years later, we're now taking milk from him and turning that into a range of cheeses too. And I'm really excited about that. Sometimes it overshadows when I should probably be talking about our sheep farming and our goat farming, because his farming, but partly because I get really excited about it. The opportunity for us to make more cheeses, different cheeses, and a slightly bigger scale. So we produce, in total, 10 tons of sheep's cheese here a year from our milk. We produce probably 8 or 10 tons of goat cheese, which is micro. It sounds a lot, but over a whole year, it's small quantities. But yeah, the opportunity is there for us to maybe make 50 to 100 tons with his milk if we were to scale and do that. So
Wow.
that kind of makes me excited that we could have a real impact on the cheese that people are eating. Right? It wouldn't need to just be, for the very specialist niche sort of artisan market. We could make cheese that maybe the local kids could have in their cheese sandwiches at school. That sort of that side of things, so that does get me excited a bit more and that's not to neglect, the artisan roots of what we are. St. James is a high quality cheese. I wish everybody was eating it, and I wish we, in a sense, I wish none of it had to leave the county and we'd all consume it here. But it's because of the nature of what it is, it's expensive, it's limited quantities, and so that this other idea is that we can add more value to our community locally. So if we can buy milk, work with other farms, work with other high quality milk, we can maybe sort of transform more than just our farm. We can expand out. So that's kind of the program we're in at the moment, which is an expansion. I have to be honest, we're expanding our business to accommodate, to work with more milk, but milk from these credible, quality, reliable farming systems, sustainable farming systems. So that's where we are. Of course, that means searching new products, new markets, finding new ways to sell cheese, finding new customers to buy cheese, really disrupting the space that's there and saying, well, how do we convert a chain of cafes to use our, cow's milk halloumi product or style product on their menu when they can't even call it halloumi? How do we do that? And how do we do it when, they're faced with a deduction off their bottom line of 30 grand a year if they swap to organic conservation practices, right? It's like, that's a challenge for us that we're trying to work out. Well, maybe we have to do things a little bit differently and approach things differently. But the idea being that actually we can make that, if we can displace a more industrial product with, one that supports proper farming, quality farming, then that feels like a job we have to do. I have to do that job. That's my responsibility, I guess. We have to try and change that food system where we can make change. If we can get people eating cheese from better farming systems, then that's a result. More people eating better cheese would be my new holy grail mission. If I was going again, how do we get more people eating better cheese would be the next Nuffield question. If I was allowed to do two, which but yeah, that's the future. So the future is more, I have to say, but working differently, trying to support those farmers around us that we work with to be, I guess, a meaningful sort of, firstly, an employer in our area, meaningful jobs and employment. I want to know that kids locally like me might rub shoulders with a cheesemaker like I did. Got that opportunity. I'd like to think that could be something that St. James Cheese, that we could do that. We could give people opportunity to go outside, to think outside of just, they're just dairy farming, or, the milk just gets picked up, taken in a tanker and ends up God knows where. Well, actually, no, maybe this could be a platform for somebody to follow a career in cheese or a passion for cheese in the future, or a passion for farming. And maybe, other farmers who think, we could produce milk differently. Maybe we'll go and talk to St. James Cheese. Maybe we'll either set up our own dairying, or maybe we'll collaborate with them to do something. So that would be the idea, is that we create opportunity in our local area, and meaning and value in our local area. And in the meantime, producing better quality cheese for more people to eat.
Oh, Martin, I think what you and Nicola have built so far, and what you're moving forward to is it's super exciting. So yeah, it's well done. We're going to finish with the final two questions, which I ask everyone at the end of the show. The first is, if you have a message for the public, what would it be?
Eat better cheese. That would be one message. Life is too short to eat boring cheese.
I couldn't agree more.
I think just to ask questions and support it. If you like what someone's doing, you like the sound of this, you like the idea that local people get to do decent jobs, and be interested in what they do, and farmers get to do things well and to the highest standard that they want to do it, then pay for it, right? Go in your local cheese shop, buy a lump of cheese, ask where it comes from, ask who farmed it, ask what the connection is, and ensure, like you would with fair trade coffee, ensure that where possible, everyone through the chain is getting rewarded for their work, But I think that so the message to the public was, support your independent shops, support your independent stores, and your independent farms and cheesemakers where you can. I think that goes without saying. But ask questions and be honest. If something's really, really cheap in a supermarket, And even though it says made by some, made up farm name or whatever, and it's got a picture of a cow on the front, be honest with yourself. Do you think that cheese at that price means that everyone in that supply chain is getting rewarded for their hard work? And I think a lot of people, a lot of public, if you stood in front of them in Tesco's and with the packet in your hand and asked them to justify how much, for example, how does a chicken cost, £4? I think most people, if you really pitched it to them, could honestly could answer the question, yeah, you're right, I should put that back down and go shop somewhere else. I think, there's a question about affordability. We're living through cost of living. I'm totally aware of that. Just like everybody, it's true. But I think there's a sense that we've been used to cheap food for too long. And it's at the expense of opportunity in food as an industry and a business. Enthusiasm like mine has come through working in the independent, right? I've had chance to travel. I've had chance to engage with, cheesemakers in Europe, in America. I've got chance to follow and pursue my passion, which I think I've been really fortunate for that. But I've done it in spite of the British food industry. 76% of food in the UK goes through supermarkets, and they haven't supported 1 ounce of my vision or dream, But yet the independent food sector has managed to give me opportunity to travel, to meet people from all over the world, from different backgrounds, different cultures, and to come back and spread that message on my farm in Cumbria. So, what an amazing achievement of the anti-food system that we have, the alternative food system, which represents a small percentage, has given this great opportunity to me and to lots of others like me who are passionate and doing their bit, or trying to do their bit. We're supported in spite of the British food system. So I think, if you can avoid the supermarkets, shop local, maybe not local, but shop, with an independent, wherever that may be. That's my advice to the public. Question 1.
Awesome. And your message to farmers?
Farmers, get out of your own way. There's a lot of smart people out there who have the answer. Stop telling them that it's not the right answer. I think farmers, the smart farmers, have the ability to get out of their own way and to collaborate with other people. Where we've done well, it's because we collaborate. Where we've had success, it's because we've collaborated. There's a lot of landowners out there don't know what to do with the land. There's a lot of farmers don't really know what to do with the farm. Trust me, somebody out there from a different background to yourself or from your walk of life, somebody out there has an answer how to make your farm profitable. Just open the door and let them in. Talk to these people, because we're a weird mix of people in the UK. We're 66 million people. Farmers are 180,000 of them or less. The idea that you're going to find the answers that the 66 million want from your group of friends in the 180,000 is absurd, really. So I think opening the doors to people with vision, with ideas, as Mary Holbrook opened the door to me in Somerset, I think that's where the potential lies. And I think if farmers can get out their own way and open the door to collaboration, maybe take a little bit of risk on people, at a personal level. I know so many people who wanted to get into farming or do things, and each time they struggle with access to land, access to capital, access to, to a market or whatever, or premises, and yet I look around me and I see empty buildings, I see empty farms, I see farmyards, I see farmers complain they've got nowhere to sell their products. And yet, on the other hand, there's people who want to sell it, there's people who want to buy it, there's people who want to handle it, process it. So I think farmers get out of your own way, collaborate, open your minds, and and engage with those people who are, passionate and inspired to make change.
It's a great message. How do our listeners follow you, help you, get involved?
If you want to follow my rantings and political aggravation, go on Twitter. If you want to look at pictures of broken tools in my workshop and me scratching my head, go on Instagram. If you want to follow anything meaningful and important about our cheese, follow Nicola on Facebook. And then, if you want to know about our cheese, the Courtyard Dairy is my self-appointed PR master, Andy Swinscoe at the Courtyard, hugely supportive for us as a business. So, and he does a much better job than us telling our customers about what he does with our cheese. Likewise, Neil's Yard Dairy do the same, and 2 Pound Street. There's a lot of cheese businesses out there who support us and work with us. So, go in your local independent cheese shop and ask about us, and we'll be there. Buy our cheese.
Well, Martin, you're a very busy man. Really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate everything you're doing. It's a very exciting story. So thank you for telling it to us.
No, great to talk to you. Thank you for your work in highlighting our story and getting the message out. Thank you.
My pleasure. That is it for today. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Next week, we're heading north. Again, we'll be on the north coast of Scotland in Caithness to meet mixed farmer Ranald Angus. On the Rural Business Focus podcast this week, I'm joined by Jamie Perry, who is Director of Lasting Change, the Hope Revolution Foundation, to talk about the big subject of hope. Rural Business Focus comes out every Tuesday morning and is all about inspiring and informing rural businesses to help them to be their very best. So if that sounds of interest and you haven't listened to that, please head over to wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thanks again to Martin for today and to our primary podcast sponsor, A Plan Rural Insurance, for supporting the show. Please see the show notes for more information and for any links mentioned today. And now, though, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great week.